I lost my mom back in 2007, and it was single-handedly the most devastating experience that I've ever experienced in my life. I watched it redefine me as a man, redefine me as a believer. I watched it redefine my family in ways that are profound. In celebration of Mother's Day, I usually, pay homage to all of the women that have acted as surrogates in my life. And I really appreciate all of the women that have been mothers to me in the absence of my mother. But you only have one, You only have one. And mine happened to be pretty irreplaceable. I will say that now that I'm older, I've grown a vast appreciation, a great appreciation for my mom and some of the things that I learned from her and the things that she taught me. However, the most important thing that she taught me and the greatest gift that she ever gave me was the wisdom to know, to hear, know, and obey God's voice. And I know to many that may sound abstract because one of the things that Corona has revealed to me that I had no true appreciation for, just in talking to people during this pandemic, is that many people don't know the voice of God. Many people don't even believe that God speaks to them. And when I think back to how, in so many words, I was tipped off that God speaks, I remember that it was my mom that taught me that. Growing up, I used to hear a voice, that would just always pre-warn me of things. Many people will call it premonition. Many people will call it your conscious, or gut feeling, or whatever. But I've come to know that to be the voice of God in my life. And so I realized that not a lot of people have identified God's voice in their life, even though he speaks. He speaks. In some of the most subtle and some of the most profound ways. I think Corona is revealing one of the more profound ways that God speaks. But I would say that he speaks to the world, but to each and every individual, there is a voice that we've come to know as our conscience. We've come to know as the angel on this shoulder and the devil on that shoulder, or whatever. But in reality, the truth is that more than likely, that's the voice of God speaking to you. How I've come to know when it's not just or not just me, or my mind wandering, is that one thing that I know is that God is never going to tell me to do anything that will harm myself or harm someone else, and be intentionally vindictive. The voice that speaks to me, it warns me of dangers before I arrive in many of those situations. Many of us know it as that feeling where something told me to. I was going to go to the stove, but something told me to. We've limited or demoted the voice of God to our conscience, or something told us to. But I've learned that voice speaks. God speaks, and you can speak back. And He will lead and guide you in the way that you should go. Here, for those of you guys who don't believe, or may even be skeptical about that voice, think of everyone in the Bible, particularly those who were used greatly by God. God spoke to them. Let's go to Moses. He spoke to Moses initially in a burning bush. And then He spoke to Moses again as a pillar of fire, spoke to the children of Israel in all of these dramatic signs and ways, because they weren't familiar with His voice. They had spent a lot of time worshiping other gods and being caught up in Egyptian culture that they had lost. They had lost the ability to hear God's voice articulate what He was saying to the people and obey it. Think about Abraham. How Abraham, out of a world full of people, heard a voice that told him, that said, Abraham, Abraham, get thee out from your countrymen, and I'm going to make you the father of many nations. That voice was true. Like, to this day, Abraham is known as the father of most of the largest nations in the world. And most religions, whether or not we agree on our perspective of God, we agree on Abraham, ironically. And he was known to be a man of faith, but God spoke to him in a voice that sometimes only he could hear. And sometimes that voice didn't always say things that he understood. And sometimes he didn't always agree. God told him he was going to have a son. His wife laughed and he questioned, like, yo, what are you talking about? How am I have a son and I'm old? And but that was something that God told him, that He didn't make no grand announcement in the sky. It was something He told to Abraham specifically. And so that voice that we've learned to interpret as our consciousness, that something told us voice, I encourage everyone to get to know God through your inner self, because the reality of it is that He's always knocking on the door of your heart, waiting to have real relationship with you. Not a relationship where, oh, I believe in God, or, I believe in God on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, or when I lose my job, I pray, and, somehow He come through, and so I know it's Him because He take good care of me. But what do you offer to the relationship that you have with God? God ain't in it for no one-sided deal, and that's the real. So you gotta want to get to know Him, and the best way to get to know Him is to listen, trust Him, and obey Him. That voice we know as our conscience, many people may call it the Holy Spirit or whatever, but at the end of the day, the source is God. And my mom taught me that, and it has guided me all my life. It has guided me through some really difficult times, but it's protected me, because she taught me to trust it. She taught me to listen, and she taught me to obey it. And that voice is the wisest voice that I've ever heard. And I've heard many people speak. Obama was a great orator. Martin Luther King, great orator. Malcolm X, a great orator. But nothing is more powerful and more sure than the voice of God. Many of us, and I'm going to say this and I'm going to let it go, but many of us live our life second guessing that voice. And then we find that when we make our decisions perpendicular or against that voice, we find that we usually go back to saying, something told me, I knew I should have, I knew, because, yeah, that something was trying to warn you before you made a foolish mistake. So, oh, what needless pains we bear, because we don't take our problems to God in prayer. Take all of our cares to God in prayer. So this is an invitation, not one that I have the right to extend, but it's one that I am privileged enough to extend. And that's the invitation to just get to know Daddy. Take some time and test it out. Test out that something that you keep hearing in your gut, in your spirit, in your heart, somewhere in the shadows of your mind, of your consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. Obey that. I've learned that it won't steer you wrong. One of the greatest prophets of the book, one of the greatest prophets of the book, Samuel, heard a voice and thought it was a human voice, thought it was his teacher, but it was actually the voice of God. Paul ran into Jesus through a light and fell from a donkey and heard a voice saying, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Paul wasn't on the side of the Christians. He was, not anti-God, but definitely anti-Christ in that sense. But that voice was enough to change his entire life. And he became the greatest apostle of the New Testament. All people who obeyed the voice. So, trust in the Lord with all thy heart, and lead not into thy own understanding, but in all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. I'm out. God bless.
Life has taught me to be grateful, so